Welcome, everybody. It's really an honor to be here tonight with JoeAnn Hart and Greg Gibson, and to have you all here with us for what will undoubtedly be an important evening. Greg Gibson is an important part of the fabric of our community and has been for years. I'm going to read what he wrote for his bio, and then I'm going to say a couple sentences if I can get through it. Since the murder of his son Galen in 1992, Greg Gibson has been an advocate for sensible gun laws. His first book, Gone Boy, was in part a study of guns in America. Over the past few years, he has concentrated on finding new ways of thinking and writing about the problem of gun violence. And that's all I can muster. Greg Gibson.
Thank you, Amanda. That was a brilliant introduction. And thank you, Gloucester Writers Center, and thank you, Rocky Neck Cultural Center. And thank you all for coming out for what promises to be a fascinating and possibly grisly evening. Polls and surveys tell us that 80 to 90% of Americans are in favor of universal background checks, and that more than half of Americans are just think we should have better gun laws. However, only maybe 10% of Americans can get it together to put their clickers down, get off their couches, and do anything about it. This troubling disparity has been pissing off gun control advocates for decades. So much to the point that they've even got a name for it now. In academia, it's referred to as the gun control paradox, which is the irreconcilability of survey results with political reality. Nobody knows really why this happens or what to do about it, which I guess is why it's called a paradox. But I got interested in it. For the last few years, I've been thinking about how I might, by telling my own story in writing and performance, might break through this barrier of, I don't know what it is, self-absorption or stupidity or distraction that accounts for that vast gap of people who say but don't do. And some of my attempts have had some moderate success. I've got a long piece coming out in the New York Times Sunday Review June 2nd. Unless Trump decides to nuke North Korea, in which case all bets are off and it won't mean much anyway. But many of my other attempts at this question have been what I could only refer to as experimental, which in writer talk means unpublishable. So that when somebody tells you about this great writer who's just published just written an experimental novel, what that means generally is that no commercial publisher would touch it with a 10-foot pole. So along those lines, along those experimental lines, I've been thinking long and hard about how to get that lumpen mass in. And the only thing I can think is, what is something that we could all relate to? What are the ideas? What are the tropes? What are the themes that all America can relate to, so we can bring us together and have some kind of conversation about this thing? And I had a lot of ideas, but one of the most well, in my opinion, one of the best ideas that I've had is zombies. I mean, I know you're going to laugh, but I mean, think about it. I mean, almost everybody really digs zombies, and even the people that don't like zombies have a sort of fascination, morbid fascination for zombies. But if you dig a little deeper, you see that in a deeply subconscious and subliminal way, there's a totally organic connection between zombies, people, and guns. Because what is the purpose of zombies? What are zombies doing? What do they exist for? Well, in dramatic terms, they gorp human flesh, and they represent a slow-moving menace, but mostly they get shot. So we've got people, we've got zombies, and we've got guns. So my experimental works have been an attempt, well, this one I'm going to read tonight is an attempt to interrogate the various aspects of this strange relationship between zombies, guns, and people. But here I must give a content warning. Some of the material that will come up here is graphic and gritty. So if anyone feels like they're going to be traumatized by this, well, you probably shouldn't have come in the first place. But if you're just here, if you're just here to hear the second half, come back in 25 minutes. I promise I will not take it personally. This experimental piece is called Survivor Apocalypse Manifesto. And it comes in parts, sort of like it's based on Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, but this has 14 parts. I don't know if that's better or not. Let's. 1, Lord of the Flies. I'm holed up in my shack in a distant corner of the North Woods. It's cold and quiet and very still. I have dried and canned foods, jugs of drinking water, solar-powered LED lights, and plenty of sweet, dry apple wood to burn. I've set myself the task of composing a Survivor Apocalypse Manifesto. But I am not a survivalist. I'm a survivor of gun violence. For years, I've sought new ways of talking and thinking about the problem of gun violence in America, some way to break through the indifference of the American people. I see myself as an anti-Ted Kaczynski, an un-Unabomber, engaged in the creation of a subtly explosive document which, by its eloquence, charm, and irrefutable logic, will put an end to gun violence as we know it, much as Jerry Rubin and Ed Sanders levitated and exorcised the Pentagon in 1967. But it's not going to be that easy this time around, for the simple reason that most non-survivors don't give a hoot about the problem of gun violence in America. As they've demonstrated ad nauseum, the pink-faced white men in power don't care, and that vast majority of citizens who tell pollsters they favor stronger gun laws don't care either. If they did, they'd already have voted the pink-faced politicians who don't care out of office. Who, then, is left to deal with the eradication of gun violence? The survivors of gun violence, that's who. And many more people who are in imminent danger of being personally affected by gun violence, which includes everyone. Too bad for you if you don't get the truth in this. The purpose of the Survivor Apocalypse Manifesto should therefore be clear. First, however, I must deal with the fact of woodland life. In the fall, a particular species of fly crawls into every cranny of a place like this to sleep through the winter. When I opened the door this afternoon for the first time since October, the floor was covered with them, right where they dropped when the temperature fell low enough to knock them out. I swept them up and threw them away. Then I lit a fire in the wood stove. To my horror, the warmth brought more flies back to life. Many more, crawling out of whatever fly holes they'd been sleeping in. Thousands of them, big and fat. They're called cluster flies because they cluster, and right now they're clustering on the window panes, marring my view of the highlands. It's disgusting. I'm sorry to say that composition of the Survivor Apocalypse Manifesto will be postponed owing to the necessity of initiating a cluster fly holocaust. No wonder Kaczynski went nuts. But there's always something, isn't there? Some impediment, some fly in the ointment. What does it mean, well-regulated militia? What is the definition of an assault rifle? Why don't we just enforce the laws already on the books? This is not the time for such talk. This is the time for thoughts and prayers. 2. In 1978, my sister Wendy died, as we say, by her own hand, which had a revolver in it, which was pointed at her heart when she squeezed the trigger. Women tend to go for the heart, men the head. She purchased her gun at a pawn shop the day before her death, an unfortunate impulse shopping decision that would be just as easy today in many states as it was in Nashua, New Hampshire in 1978. Most people who survive a suicide attempt never try again. If she decided instead to hang herself, she would have had only a 60% chance of success, poison 40, cutting 2. With a gun, the chances of success rise to 90%, though it's not really success, is it? 14 years later, in December 1992, my 18-year-old son Galen was killed in a school shooting at Simon's Rock College in western Massachusetts. He was the random victim of a disturbed fellow student who'd bought a used semi-automatic rifle at a local gun shop the afternoon of the shootings. The killer modified his gun to accept 30-round magazines, which he'd ordered using his mother's credit card, along with 180 rounds of ammunition, from a mail-order company in South Carolina. Purchases of the gun, the ammunition, and the aftermarket accessories were perfectly legal then, and they'd be just as legal now in many states as they were in 1992. These events have given me the unusual perspective of having spent 40 years closely watching nothing happen, or watching a lot happen, most of which involves people getting killed by guns and politicians doing nothing about it. Let us observe a moment of silence. Let us attend to the buzzing of flies. 3, Survivor Apocalypse. How difficult is it in the wake of the 573 killed and injured in the Las Vegas shooting of 2017 to imagine unhinged nut jobs across the nation vying to top the Vegas shooters' total? There are madmen enough, God knows, and we have guns for them all, something just shy of 300 million guns already in circulation in this country. How different, then, would it be to further imagine an ongoing national gun slaughter insanity Olympics? That's why we buy guns for ourselves, isn't it? To keep us safe from people with guns? I have forearm tendinitis from swatting flies. One problem leads to another. For each of the 35,000 killed by a gun and for each of the 100,000 people wounded by a gun every year in America, there are what? 10 friends, relatives, loved ones, co-workers, and classmates for whom the world will never be the same? Say 135,000 times 10. That would be more than 1 million each year whose lives have been turned to shit by a gun. The NRA has 5 million members. How long will it be until survivors outnumber them? We already do, of course. We just don't understand this. We don't know who we are, and we've forgotten where we come from. The purpose of the Survivor Apocalypse Manifesto should therefore be clearer still. I'm going to make the long trek into town and buy me a dustbuster battery-operated vacuum thingy, the portable kind you use to clean off the mats in your car. I'm going to use it to suck the flies off the windows and the window ledges. There are solutions. There are things that work. Sensible gun laws save lives. 4, the zombification of gun violence. Gun violence is a virus, a sickness deep in the body of our nation. It was dormant like the flies. Then some change in the environment animated the virus, and it began running its fucked up program, the sole purpose of which is to replicate itself, like cancer, except it's highly contagious. That's how it works with zombies, right? My grandson spends a great deal of time killing zombies. He's 7 years old. If I'd had a computer when I was 7, it would have been the same for me. Maybe bad genes in our family, or maybe that's just the way healthy males are in America. We're a brutal, violent people. It's in our DNA. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand stayed calm, negotiated deals with Britain for the sovereignty. We shot our way out. Then we polished off the Redskins. Now we turn on one another or on ourselves. 2/3 of all gun deaths are suicides, mostly old white guys and troubled teens. White people tend to be violent toward themselves, black people toward one another. I don't know why. It's just a statistic, a number. It was not a number to my father, however. He was Wendell. She was his darling, Wendy. It is a scientific fact that dying stars emit mysterious radiation which traverses the universe at light speed and penetrates everything, causing constant mutation in the genetic material common to all forms of organic life. The zombie virus is therefore constantly mutating, as is the flu we fear every winter. This was how we got zombies in the first place. A virus that might have started as chicken pox for all anyone knows. One day the mutation took a deadly turn and people everywhere were stricken with it, soon to be reanimated as the living dead, doomed to shuffle around, tortured by the constant desire to gorp human flesh. It must be awful, that desire, the relentlessness of the gorp urge. You can hear them moan from it on the zombie TV shows. It's a metaphor for something that's wrong with us, I think. This is what Wayne LaPierre, executive vice president of the NRA, has in mind when he says, quote, colleges are breeding grounds for socialists who will take our guns. Socialists being like zombies, which he hates and fears, socialists and zombies, presumably. But here's the thing. Sooner or later, after zillions of genetic combinations have been rolled, we're going to arrive at, can you dig it? Vegetarian zombies. A rustling in the backyard. You look out the window and it's them again, a pack of zombies chowing on your hydrangeas. Hey, get out of there, shoot! You have to squirt them with a hose. Oh, they hate that. Sooner or later, they'll mate with the meat eaters. I don't think any of the TV shows have delved deeply enough into zombie sex, causing the meat eaters to turn veggie too, because the new mutation is stronger and more vital than the weary old trope of whatever we did wrong to deserve the virus metaphor in the first place. I'm going into town. 5. Zombies and the NRA. No sooner had I returned to my shack than a fluffy, anomalous snowflake tumbled out of the gray April sky. The breeze picked up. Then another flake appeared. By dusk, we were in the midst of a full-on blizzard. I couldn't even see the outhouse. But I did manage to obtain, along with a handle of Jack Daniels, a Dyson Max Portavac, which has proved to be effective. I filled 2 canisters with cluster flies in no time. I recently read a tell-all book by an ex-NRA lobbyist and was surprised to learn that the NRA was founded in the years after the Civil War for the purpose of improving our marksmanship so we'd be better at killing people in the next war. For most of the 20th century, it was oriented toward conservation and hunting. Then, in the 1970s, there was a power struggle among NRA leaders. The sportsmen lost out, and the Second Amendment nuts took over, but they were too simple-minded and were not sufficiently clever to maintain their hold on power. Eventually, they were displaced by cynical, opportunistic Second Amendment nuts of Wayne LaPierre's ilk, which was why the lobbyist who wrote the tell-all book in the first place quit the NRA. He was a Second Amendment nut, and he disapproved of the direction the cynical Second Amendment nuts were taking the NRA, which turned out to be this. Wayne LaPierre spends a great deal of time and energy keeping me in a state of fear, agitation, and paranoia. He does this by warning me repeatedly that I am about to lose my constitutional rights, beginning with the Second Amendment, which enables us, by means of our guns, to protect all our other rights from government usurpation. For the past 3 years, I joined the NRA to keep my enemies closer. I've been receiving several personalized emails a week from Wayne announcing that the final battle for our freedom is at hand. If I send him another $35, or whatever you can afford, Greg, right now, if I send him that money, we may fend off socialist ideologues who want to take our guns and make us all the same. Sort of like zombies, which is why Wayne hates and fears socialists. Zombies are a metaphor for college students. But it's always about that $35 or whatever I can afford. The NRA uses the paranoia it inspires in me solely for the purpose of enhancing its own wealth and power, much like that virus ceaselessly running the fucked up program dedicated to its own replication, a cancer in the body politic, you might say. Six, the omega point. In March 2018, I was in Washington attending the March for Our Lives. I stood with other gun violence survivors assembled from across the nation down the years in a bullpen near the big front stage. Colleagues and friends, fellow members of the club nobody wants to join. Natasha Christopher, whose son Akil had been shot and killed on his 14th birthday. She now works with survivors in Brooklyn. Reverend Sharon Risher, family and friends killed at that church in Charleston, speaking out in their names against violence, racism, and hatred. Pulse nightclub mom, Christine Leinen, I am my son's voice. Mark Barden and his wife, Jackie, from Sandy Hook. My 18-year-old son, Galen, and their 6-year-old son, Daniel, had been born and murdered on the same day, 20 years apart. Like that, an involuntary shudder. You realize you've been wounded too. I was sure we were approaching the omega point in our country's ongoing survivor apocalypse, swarming like bees in the aerial photo down from Pennsylvania Avenue and surging out of the frame from DC into Boston, New York, Houston, Atlanta, LA, a massive cascading collapse of the rickety national bullshit grandstand, spilling innocent spectators into the streets already teeming with survivors. Such a moment, the omega point, would be the occasion of our discovery that we are each wounded by every needless killing, and that we are innocent of nothing. Kids get shot in Parkland, and all of Parkland suffers. Parkland gets shot. America bleeds. That radiation from dying stars, it penetrates everything. Excuse me. I think it's the locust trees, or maybe it's the oak trees. 7. Contagion. It seems so bizarre, so out of the ordinary, so newsworthy. Mom and I watched it unfold on Huntley Brinkley. Chet sat in front of a map of Texas and told us what had happened. The day of the Texas Tower shooting, the first day of August 1966, Charles Whitman is barricaded in the observation deck atop the tower overlooking the campus of the University of Texas, moving from one slot to the next with his trusty Remington and his M1 carbine, aiming, taking this one, that one shot, one man, as he'd been trained to do during his unhappy hitch in the Marines. Bang! The fetus is murdered in her belly. The young husband, alarmed at he knows not what, says, "What's the matter, honey?" And bang, he's dead too. 16 killed on campus, 31 wounded, wife and mother murdered back home. 3 brave men worked their way to the observation deck. A civilian named Alan Crum, the proverbial good guy with a gun, is first on the scene. In his excitement, he accidentally discharges his weapon, revealing his presence to Whitman, who turns to investigate the sound. Officer Ramiro Ray Martinez fires his revolver at Whitman, missing his target both times, whereupon Officer Houston McCoy hits Whitman with 2 blasts from his shotgun. Martinez grabs the shotgun from McCoy and fires into Whitman's body at point-blank range. In the crime scene photograph, Whitman's face looks like hamburger. After Whitman has been neutralized, Martin runs from the scene yelling, "I got him, I got him." His self-published memoir, They Call Me Ranger Ray, appears in 2005. Officer McCoy, the man who actually got Charles Whitman, becomes an alcoholic. One writer calls him Whitman's last victim. 8. Regarding the eradication of gun violence. In my days of agony, on the worst parts of my journey back to you, I sometimes amused myself by noting events in the parallel universe of mysterious viruses. Inevitably, over there, some genius figures out that vegetarian zombies can be trained to accomplish simple chores. Or maybe this is discovered simultaneously in many places around the globe, the way momentous cultural shifts often occur. Humankind begins using zombies to accomplish inhumanly boring tasks, such as sorting recyclables or attending poetry readings. In return for their services, and to keep them away from our gardens, we feed them from 100-pound sacks of zombie kibble. This foolishness is a metaphor for the paranoia of Second Amendment nuts. The eradication of gun violence, however, is more complex. Sooner or later, someone's teenage daughter is going to have to fall in love with a zombie boy. Garthor and Juliet. That's the kind of mutation we Americans will have to undergo in order to stop our relentless gorping of violence. Or we could just have the government take away all the guns, but who wants to give Wayne LaPierre the satisfaction of having been right? 9, the delusion. The impressive wound ballistics of the AR-15 are not accidental. The thing was designed to do what it does. A .223 round impacts with such velocity that it generates an explosive shock wave inside the target. Also, the bullet will tumble, enhancing its destructive properties. Don't let any of those Second Amendment nuts fool you. We may not be able to settle on a decisive characterization of an assault rifle, but an AR chambered for a .223 or similar round will make a mess of a human body. It will do so 30 or even 60 rounds at a time, as fast as the lunatic on the other end can pull the trigger. The industry's characterization of this type of weapon as a modern sporting rifle is an obscenity. My son's killer, fortunately for Simon's Rock College, was financially constrained. Furthermore, he was a novice, having never fired a gun before he went on his spree. He settled for a used SKS, a cheap carbine that fired the lower velocity 7.62 by 39 millimeter round. On top of that, the aforementioned financial constraints led him to purchase less expensive full metal jacket bullets. Because they are jacketed, the projectiles tend to go through a body rather than disintegrating as a hollow point bullet might, or tumbling and generating a shock wave as the .223 round does. The killer's chest shot shattered my son's sternum, passed into his chest cavity, severed blood vessels, passed through a lung, severed the trachea, passed through the seventh rib, and exited the back. He died on his college library floor, bullets zinging past, friends and classmates freaking out, watching one of their own strangle and bleed to death. After he'd killed 2 people and wounded 4, the wannabe psycho killer is gun jammed. The magazine wasn't seating properly, and he didn't know how to clear the jam. This saved many lives. When such a thing happens to your son or daughter, you don't experience it as a chapter from a wound ballistics textbook. It is the most painful, calamitous, life-changing event imaginable. If you manage to not kill yourself or someone else, as I just barely managed not to do, and if you don't go so crazy as to become completely dysfunctional, you might fall prey to the very reasonable delusion that once people hear your story, once they learn how horrific and widely damaging gun murder is, they'll be inspired to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone ever again. This same delusion caused those Florida teens to speak out as they have. The worst thing imaginable had just happened to them. Surely, once they let the world know about it, the world would rise as one and cry, "Enough." I worry about how those kids will be feeling years down the road when the journalists have moved on to other stories and they are left with only the horrific images of what happened, set against the backdrop of America's vast, self-absorbed indifference. 10. Teddy bears. Sometime early in the process, grieving parents began appearing in news reports of mass shootings, running their own version of the delusion. These parents needed so desperately for the deaths of their daughters and sons to have meaning that they subjected themselves to news jackals in order to be heard as they cried, "Enough." Unfortunately, not even Anderson Cooper could transform that plea for action into action. The viewing world sees it as content, like all the rest of the media stuff they consume. Entertainment, if you will. After Sandy Hook, people sent teddy bears as a demonstration of their sympathy, I suppose. Thousands of teddy bears. Then tens of thousands of teddy bears. Sending teddy bears went as viral as zombies. 18-wheelers full of teddy bears. The town had to rent storage space to stash the teddy bears until they could figure out what to do with them all. Hey, how about calling your representatives and telling them to support background checks and magazine size limits? Nah, I'd rather send a teddy bear. Okay, I'll stop. 11, doing the math. Yeah, Emma Gonzalez has got it going. I hung out with her dad for a while at the march, and he told me something fascinating. I may not have it exactly right, but I got the gist. In the class periods preceding the shootings that day, those Parkland kids just happened to be learning about gun violence and the NRA. Someone else told me the Holocaust had been discussed as well. Point is, when that shit went down, they were primed, and thanks to excellent schooling, well trained. What they did was more like an evolution than a mutation. Those teens understood, in that way that young people sometimes have of seeing right to the heart of things, that for as long as they've been alive, school shootings have been the norm, and no one has cared enough to make them stop. They used their trained-up public school intelligence and their teenage snark to call us out on this ugly truth. Isn't it wonderful to be schooled by a bunch of angry teens smart enough to have done the math? No BS, no logic chopping. The refreshing black and white of it. Divide Marco Rubio's annual NRA dole by the number of students in Florida, and the resulting $5 is the value they reckon Rubio places on each student's life. That figure might be high, kids. Do the math again next month. Don't let them get away. 12, survivors and zombies. There's little difference existentially between zombies and survivors. Surviving is not easy. Sitting in my dead son's room was not easy. Watching the clock not move was not easy. Not wanting to live was not easy. You wonder how people endure such things. 6 months, a year, 2 and 3 years. The pain keeps not going away. There is a part of our grief, a deep and mysterious part, that we cannot reach. Life seems made of grief, and we have no idea why. But looking back now, I think I can. I think I know. We were grieving for ourselves as well as Galen, and we didn't even realize it. We'd lost Galen, and with his death, our own lives, our old lives, also died. That we had perished. Then slowly, what was left of us began the long crawl out of grief. We came to some sort of life again, reanimated in a world that had no Galen in it, and we were stunned by that fact, impaired, grieving for ourselves as well as Galen, all unaware, shuffling along like zombies. 13. Garthor and Juliet. People have a terrible time talking with survivors. I could feel it during the first weeks I dared venture from my house after Galen died, walking down the snacks and soda aisle at the supermarket, my townspeople carefully not gawking at their own worst nightmare. Eventually, I realized that my discomfort was a byproduct of the power that had been granted me. In exchange, by some cosmic measure, for all I had suffered and lost. We survivors rarely recognize it as such, mostly because we feel so lousy in the first place, receptive only to its negative aspects. But I'm here to tell you, it is a power. I don't have much patience for survivor jargon. Oprah and Dr. Phil can keep their closure and forgiveness and the like. But for me, journey works. I have been on a journey. And if you're a survivor reading this, you know you've been on a journey as well, through a hideous and difficult land. And that you've seen and felt things other people can't begin to imagine. You have been in the very depths of your agony to the place where life and death have their origins. Can you imagine being empowered by such an experience? There's no telling what you might bring back from a place like that, the things you might do and say. People would attend to your words in a very different way. 14, untitled but possibly to be continued. Here, this exercise must end. The battery on my Dyson Max Portavac is dead, and I'm running low on food. Anyway, I have to give a talk in New York in a couple of days. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about. I guess I'll tell my story. I'm pretty sure that once people learn how horrific and widely damaging gun murder is, they'll rise as one and cry, enough. My avatar, the survivor apocalyptician, having returned from the place where life and death have their origins, has, on occasion, spoken and acted from his experience of that place. It is worth noting that in these moments, people do indeed attend to him and his words differently than they otherwise might. Most of them run the other way. His attempts to find new ways of speaking and thinking about the problem of gun violence remain a work in progress. His every effort to penetrate the rhinoceros hide of America's self-absorption has failed. His hopes of swaying that lumpish 80% in the middle who say they want change but do nothing to bring it about have been dashed repeatedly on the cruel shores of American indifference. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was brilliant. I know a lot of you people here knew Galen, and I know you all agree that the world is certainly a far less bright and wonderful place without him. And I don't know how you don't go nuts. But then again, I'm not sure. Maybe
I am.
All right. Now, what a privilege it is to introduce my dear friend, JoeAnn Hart. JoeAnn is the ultimate multitasker. While our kids were young and carpooling to the same school, I was sort of peripherally aware that she was finishing up a master's degree at Bennington while raising her 3 children and taking care of a changing cast of farm animals and writing articles for the Globe magazine and other publications and working on her novels and being involved in political campaigns and being married to Gordo. And as it turns out, quietly trying to untangle one big and very tightly knotted ball of string. Now, we've all had to untangle things from time to time, right? You loosen it, you reweave it, you study the thing, you walk away from it, you come back, and either you figure it out, or, if it's beyond hope, you abandon the project. JoeAnn worked on one tightly knotted ball of string for 20 years. This mystery would not let her go, and she would not let it go. She pried it open inch by inch, slowly peeling away layers that initially would not budge, going back to it over and over again. Guiding her kids from soccer games through medical school, and then her life through writing assignments, novel deadlines, through the animal comings and goings and the planting and endless weeding at Ramparts Farm, through tramping around New Hampshire and Pennsylvania and who knows where to get out the votes, through urgent pleas on social media to reduce plastic waste, and through all of this and through all of life's other many distractions, JoeAnn returned over and over again to the mystery that had been nagging at her since 1976. Now, Shakespeare wasn't talking about JoeAnn specifically when he wrote of patience on a monument, but he certainly could have been. The result is Stamford, 1976, a true story of murder, corruption, race, and feminism in the 1970s. So move over, Globe Spotlight. I give you JoeAnn Hart, gifted writer, insightful political and environmental activist, compassionate steward of abandoned donkeys, goats, and pigs, novelist, playwright, truth teller, an untangler of a stubborn mystery that refused to be solved.
MJ, that was so sweet. Thank you. Thank you, Gloucester Writers Center. Gregor, that rocked. That was an amazing reading. So honored to be up here with you. And I'm going to not read that long. I'm reading the first chapters to leave a little time for a Q&A afterwards, because I know there's some people who have already read the book and have some serious questions. The book is for sale in the back. The bookstore is here selling them, and that I'll be happy to sign books afterwards, and that there's wine and snacks as well. So what you should just know, since I'm not reading the introduction, is that this is somebody I knew, a white woman I knew in 1976 in Stamford, Connecticut, was found with an arrow through her heart. Not a gun, not a bullet pipe, but of all things, a bow and arrow. And then a few weeks later, her black boyfriend was shot and killed by the police. 20 years later, I start wondering what happened. And then it's been 20 years of researching it. I was in a biracial relationship myself at the time. My black boyfriend was Howie's best friend. And so I'm going to read from chapter 1. It was in the spring of 1999, during the end of the world as we know it build up to the millennium, when time and its significant markers were much on the collective mind, that I started thinking about writing a short piece about Howie and Margo. Armed with a quiver full of justice and indignation, I was going to reveal long-buried truths about their deaths, and with them, the underground streams of institutionalized racism and police malfeasance that once seeped through Stamford like a broken sewer. My essay was going to expose Howie and Margo's story to the cleansing light of the written word. It was going to be cut and dried, black and white, and it was going to have nothing whatsoever to do with me. That was my mission. Well, we all know what happens to missionaries. The story nearly ate me alive. I opened up a Word document and titled it Stamford. Then, just as I was about to start writing about Howie's death at the hands of the police, I realized with some surprise that I didn't know who killed Margo. And I couldn't write about Howie's violent end without first addressing hers. I presumed that her bizarre murder, certainly by some random maniac, had been solved, and I had somehow forgotten the outcome or had never been told. So I picked up the phone and called my cousin Denise. The decade of our coming of age, our teens and early 20s, not the one of our birth, makes for a generation, so that placed me and Denise squarely in the 70s. We'd rather have been members of the 60s, but we were just kids then, watching our older cousins and their friends live out the psychedelic dream in our aunt's basement. We'd hide at the bottom of the stairs in a trance, listening to our cousin Michael's band render Donovan's Season of the Witch unrecognizable. As we gazed wistfully up an imaginary road, the air smelled of pot, tobacco, and incense. The clothes were soft and loose, the feet bare. We closed our eyes and divined the future, a utopian world of pleasure and possibility. Even though Aunt Ginny had just the one child, who died in 1981 in a motorcycle accident, there was always a bedraggled soul or two on her sofa. Sometimes these were other cousins seeking a respite from their own families, but usually they were local teens who had run away from home, often just blocks away, looking to divest themselves of a middle-class existence in search of life's truths. Yes, I thought, yes. There was more to the world than what I could see in the suburban culture around me, which seemed materially bland and spiritually bereft. I was particularly fascinated with the long-haired boys who espoused a litany of freedom, justice, and rebellion. It never sunk into my tie-dyed brain that they might only be playing at being rebels, or that there was something particularly privileged about the renunciation of privilege. Most never got farther than Aunt Jenny's sofa. During the time I was with Joe, Denise had been my steady and at times only connection to my family. She'd take the train up from the Bronx where she lived to visit me and Joe in Stamford, then later in Westport. I told her everything, so I thought finding out about Margo would be as simple as a telephone call, as if I were retrieving information I had put into storage. Even then, even with decades of stability padding my bones, with marriage, 3 children, and a home hundreds of miles away from Stamford, I was uneasy. Funny, I thought to myself, it was as if I didn't really want to know what happened. It was no coincidence that I decided to find out about Margo just as my 2 girls and a boy were creeping closer to the age I was when I met Joe. When my oldest daughter started acting out in the predictable ways of adolescence, I flashed back to Margo's piteous end. Danger, danger, the alarms rang in my head. But what was there in their pampered lives for me to fear? They'd been shielded from every imaginable threat since birth, bound in car seats, topped with bicycle helmets, and slathered in 35 SPF sunscreen to protect their fair skin. And yet I knew deep down I was helpless to protect them from the unimaginable dangers, the ones where young women ended up as body dumps by the side of the road. The zeal I had devoted to grinding organic carrots for baby food had only been a talismanic right to keep that other world at bay. As my girls began to maneuver the adolescent tight wire of freedom and responsibility, I saw myself in their struggle to come to terms with what it means to be female in a world that, even after decades of feminism, can feel as if we're pedaling backward. If I could not figure out how Margo ended up in the potter's field, how would I know what the path looked like so I could place a Jersey barrier across it for my children? That seems like an absurd leap to make, but anyone who has raised a 14-year-old girl has experienced the kind of stress that can make a mother daft with paranoia. A small lump settled in my chest as I dialed Denise, and every ring on the other end of the line made me want to bail. I had to force myself to keep the receiver to my ear. What was I so afraid of? At the sound of her voice, I shot out the question as if it had been under pressure. Who killed Margo? Are you shitting me? She said, without missing a beat, not in the least bit surprised to hear Margo's name mentioned for the first time in decades, as if she'd been sitting by the phone all that time waiting for me to call. Howie killed her. Of all people, you should know that. He told you at a card game that if he was going to kill anyone, it would be with a bow and arrow. Gambling dens. I don't know what else to call them. What word is there to describe a residential basement or garage with a card table set up for a few handles of booze and a single round table for playing cards? Joe and I went to these places once in a while, mostly just to watch good poker while we sipped cheap scotch. Joe's mother, Georgia, had taught me to drink scotch after hearing me order a slow gin fizz at a bar. You've got to have a grown-up drink, sugar, and change my order to a Dewar's with a splash and a twist. Just like at the Peppermint Lounge, she said, where she once sang backup for Ray Charles. This particular garage in Stamford was no Peppermint Lounge. Asterisk, the footnote says, for those who might not know, it's a popular discotheque in New York City from 1958 to 1965, where the twist and go-go dancing originated. But in this garage, the clientele was all black men with the occasional white girlfriend like me. I could not have imagined that what I saw was only the tip of a much bigger iceberg of gambling in Stamford, black or white. It was truly an equal opportunity enterprise. Sometimes I played. They called me the White House and let me win a hand so I'd bet more and lose it all. Joe knew the game. He smiled at my first hand when I looked at him so proudly, then laughed at my second. I'd never seen a man who loved to lose as much as he did. Howie was on my left. Where was Margo? He never seemed to go anywhere with Margo. Sitting on a stool, looking down at his cards and saying that if he was going to kill someone, God knows how table talk had turned to that, it would be with a bow and arrow. It was my turn to laugh. There was so much male bravado around me, there was no taking any of it seriously. If I were reading a murder mystery and the protagonist heard the words, "If I were going to kill someone, it would be with a bow and arrow," from this Howie character, then wondered out loud a few pages later who might have killed his girlfriend with a bow and arrow, I'd close the book. No reasonable person could refuse to put such obvious pieces together. But what does reason have to do with fear? Think of obliviousness as the bubble pack of life. It kept me from breaking in transit. With no self-awareness whatsoever, I had stored Margo's arrow-pierced body where I couldn't get at her. It's not that I didn't remember Howie's telling me about his murder weapon of choice. Once Denise reminded me what I already knew. It was that, unlike Denise, my younger self had failed to connect that information to the fact of Margo's death. Or if I made the connection, I promptly severed the line. There was something about her death that went beyond reason, refusing to find a settled place in the past. To fully grasp how disturbing my own memories were to my conscious mind, consider this. The first time I made a stab at putting words on paper about Margo and Howie, I wrote a few pages, condensing their story into the basic elements of what I knew. I could feel my heart beating in my fingertips the whole time I was typing, perhaps an hour, and I was relieved when it was done. A first draft. When I read it through, I thought I had done a good job of capturing the essence of what had happened. Then, on the second reading, I realized I had left out that Margo had been killed too, not just Howie. I smiled to myself, shook my head, and put it aside. What else didn't I remember or just outright block out? I didn't know Margo that well to begin with, and it was clear from the card game episode that I had a fairly warped memory of anything in her orbit. If I was going to write about her, I couldn't rely on what was in my head. If I wanted to find out how she died, I'd have to ask the questions that I'd failed to ask back then. And even though I began this project determined to keep myself out of it, I kept turning to my younger self and asking, "Well, what did you think?" But I couldn't hear her. I could barely even see her. The thin girl with straight brown hair, the serious gray eyes that would not return my gaze. Leaving behind the memory of Margo had meant forgetting parts of myself, and I needed that 18-year-old by my side as I faced the challenge of getting 3 children through their teenage years. I wanted to gain some wisdom from that girl, who was both brave and reckless to a fault, and to do that I had to open the box marked fragile. In that box, nestled along with all my stored emotion, was a 3-pronged mission. 1, figure out what had happened to Margo. 2, remember what had been going on with me. And 3, try to understand why her death made me so wary for so long. Finding Margo seemed, at least at first, to be fairly straightforward. I relied on the archives of the Stamford Advocate, which, aside from shedding a light on the world I lived in, had the newspaper accounts of her death as well as Howie's. Through Joe, I knew Howie well enough, Margo much less so. I didn't even know who Margo's friends were. I tried to find as many people as Joe and I knew back then, but I never knew the last names of many of them to begin with. It was an enormous help to discover that Joe had written a novel using everyone's real names, more or less. Another book, Rogue Town by Vito Colucci, a nonfiction account of the 1970s Stamford Police Department, was useful as well. The internet was fairly primitive when I started this project, but even as it matured, many people have remained elusive. Some have died. Others, like Margo's family, did not want to talk. Howie's family did not want to talk. I am no investigative reporter, so I copped to the plea of not really knowing what I was doing most of the time. For instance, I did not know that regular people could employ the Freedom of Information Act to obtain criminal files, and relied instead on a reporter who was able to access Margo's murder file at the police station. Each step forward in Margo's death took time. Each step triggered an overhaul of the story, which often made me put the project aside until I could wrap my head around any ill-fitting revelations. Finding me required less research but more soul-searching. I had to read between the lines, looking hard at what I had suppressed and why. I listened to the things I did not say, watched what I did not do. I looked at how neatly I packed up Margo's death and stored it away. I compared historical fact to my memory of events. At times I questioned history, other times myself. I had to re-examine my attitudes about race and white privilege then and now. I had entered my relationship with Joe with expectations I didn't know I carried. On some unarticulated level, I was drawn to the idea of me and Joe as some manifestation of equality, both gender and racial. There we were, after all, black and white, man and woman, side by side. The racial seemed self-evident, but gender? Logic has never been idealism's strong suit. Every time I'd pointed out some inequity in our relationship to Joe, something as basic as who had first dibs on the car, he said, "What are you going to do, call now?" As he drove away laughing, he thought the National Organization of Women was a joke and feminism itself hysterically funny. It wasn't funny. It was nothing less than self-determination. It's what, in the end, we were all after. Me, Margo, Howie, Joe. We wanted equality. We wanted justice. We wanted not to be controlled by the world as it was. Thank you.